All right, let's dive into one of history's most bizarre and, let's be honest, one of its most hilarious footnotes. We are talking about a time when a national military literally declared war on its own wildlife. And, well, they lost. I mean, it sounds like the setup to a really bad joke, doesn't it? You've got a trained military, you've got rapid-fire weapons, versus a bunch of big birds. You'd think it would be an absolute cakewalk. But this isn't some hypothetical thought experiment. It actually happened. Out in the huge, sprawling farmlands of Western Australia, this completely absurd question was put to the test. And the results? Well, nobody saw them coming. So you have to be asking, how on earth did this situation even happen? Well, the Great Emu War didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was the result of a total perfect storm of economic desperation, crazy environmental pressure, and a very, very large number of birds. So let's break down the recipe for this disaster. First, after World War I, Australia gave a bunch of farmland to its returning veterans. The only problem? A lot of this land was, not great for farming. Then, bam, the Great Depression hits. The price of wheat completely tanks, and all those government promises of financial help, yeah, they vanished into thin air. And to top it all off, a massive drought kicks in. These farmers were absolutely at their breaking point. And right into this mess marches an invading army. We're talking about 20,000 emus. The drought had pushed them out of their usual spots, and they were migrating toward the coast looking for food and water. And guess what they found? All this cultivated farmland. Basically, a giant all-you-can-eat buffet set out just for them. Now, to really get this conflict, you have to understand the opponent. Emus aren't just some big chickens. They're the second largest bird in the entire world. They're nomadic, and here's the kicker. They are fast. They can sprint at nearly 30 miles per hour, which makes them an unbelievably difficult target. And they weren't just eating the crops, they were trampling everything and tearing down fences, which of course let in all sorts of other pests. And here's the thing. These weren't just any farmers. A lot of them were ex-soldiers. They'd seen what modern weapons could do. So facing this unstoppable feathered army, they went to the Ministry of Defense and asked for the one thing they thought could solve the problem: machine guns. And unbelievably, he agreed. And so the stage was set. The Australian military was deployed for what was supposed to be a wildlife management operation. The media, of course, immediately and hilariously dubbed it the Great Emu War. Let's just see how this first attempt went. Spoiler alert, it was a complete and utter farce. Okay, let's look at the two sides. In one corner, you have the military expedition, Major Meredith, 2 soldiers, 2 state-of-the-art Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammo. And in the other corner, 20,000 emus, whose tactics, as the soldiers were about to find out, were shockingly effective. The first attempt was just a comedy of errors. First, they tried to herd the emus into an ambush, but the birds were too smart. They just split up into tiny groups and ran in every direction. Later, they thought they had 1,000 emus cornered by a dam, a perfect shot, until the gun jammed after taking out a measly dozen birds. In a moment of pure desperation, they even mounted a machine gun on a truck. Turns out, the emus were faster than the truck, and the ride was so bumpy the gunner couldn't even get a single shot off. The soldiers were just stunned by how organized the emus were. One army observer wrote that the emu packs actually seemed to have leaders, these big 6-foot-tall birds that would stand watch like sentinels and warn the others when soldiers were coming. They weren't just a mindless mob at all. They were using actual tactics. In the end, the military was just getting completely outsmarted and outrun. The commanding officer, Major Meredith, was left with this kind of grudging respect. He actually compared the emus to Zulu warriors and said that they could take bullets with the, and I quote, invulnerability of tanks. I mean, that's some pretty high praise for, again, a giant flightless bird. Now, after a humiliation like that, you'd think they would have just called it a day. But no, the story doesn't end there. The farmers were still freaking out, which led to a second attempt and, eventually, an official embarrassing retreat. The local press was having an absolute field day with this story. The military's failure became this huge national joke, and it even led to some pointed questions in Parliament. So on November 8th, only 6 days after it all started, the operation was called off. The soldiers were withdrawn in defeat. But here's the thing. The emus didn't read the newspapers. They just kept on destroying crops. The farmers were still desperate, and they kept begging for help, which forced the government's hand. Just 5 days after retreating, Major Meredith and his men were sent right back out to the front lines. This second attempt was slightly more successful, but the final numbers really tell the whole story. In his official report, Major Meredith claimed they got 986 confirmed kills. Okay, but to do that, they fired almost 10,000 rounds of ammunition. That is exactly 10 bullets for every single emu killed. The only casualty on the Australian side was, as Meredith himself put it, their dignity. And maybe the biggest irony of the entire story is just how inefficient the whole military approach was. The government eventually gave up on the soldiers and turned to a much, much simpler solution: a bounty system. And the results are just stark. The big, hyped-up military operation killed less than 1,000 birds. 2 years later, a simple bounty paid to farmers resulted in over 57,000 emus being culled. So with that, an embarrassing but ultimately minor pest control operation was over. But in the decades that followed, the story took on a life of its own. It transformed from this little local farce into a piece of global folklore. And this timeline just shows the evolution perfectly. In 1932, it was just a weird local news story. By the 50s, people were looking back on it as a humiliating defeat. But it was really the rise of the internet in the 2000s that took this story and cemented it as the legend, the meme that we all know today. And that's really the key thing to remember. Despite the grand name, this wasn't some major historical conflict that the world was watching in 1932. It was a minor incident. Its global fame is a super recent thing, and it's a perfect example of how the internet can find a bizarre old story and just give it this incredible second life. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? The story of the Emu War shows that history isn't just about big battles and famous people. It's also filled with these strange, funny, and deeply human stories of failure and just plain absurdity. What other incredible tales are just sitting there in old newspapers, waiting for their moment to go viral?